The last revolutionary, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, 1939 2026. There is a city in the northeast of Iran where the dead are never quite gone. Mashhad, which means in Arabic, the place of martyrdom, has been a site of pilgrimage for over 1,000 years. At its center stands a shrine of gold and turquoise tile, the resting place of the 8th Imam of Shia Islam, Ali al-Rida, who died here in 818 CE, poisoned, it is said, on the orders of an Abbasid caliph who feared what a living Imam might inspire. Every year, tens of millions of people come to stand before his tomb. They come to grieve, to petition, to press their foreheads against cold marble and ask for the intercession of a man who died 12 centuries ago. It is a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead are understood to be provisional. When history is not past, where loss is a form of devotion, into this city on the 19th of April 1939, a boy was born. His name was Syed Ali Hussein Khamenei. His father was a mid-ranking cleric of modest means. The family was poor enough that they sometimes went to bed without dinner. He grew up in the shadow of that golden shrine. And in a place like Mashhad, you cannot grow up without learning very early what it means to mourn, what it means to wait, what it means to believe that the dead are owed something and that the living have a duty to pay. He would grow old in that belief. He would govern an entire nation in its name. And he would die at 86 in the rubble of his own capital, killed by the enemies against whom he had defined every waking hour of his adult life. This is the story of Ali Khamenei, but it is also the story of a faith, a revolution, and an idea about power that refuses, even now, to die quietly. The faith of the grieving. To understand what made Khamenei, you have to go back much further than 1939. You have to go back to a desert plain in what is now central Iraq, the year 680, and a man named Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Hussein had refused to give his allegiance to the Umayyad Caliph, Yazid, a man he considered corrupt, illegitimate, a betrayer of everything Islam was meant to be. On the plains of Karbala, surrounded by an army of thousands, he and his companions, 72 men, a number of women and children, stood their ground. They were killed, all of them. Hussein's head was cut from his body and sent to Yazid in Damascus. This happened 1400 years ago. For hundreds of millions of people alive today, it has not ended. Shia Islam, the faith of perhaps 200 million Muslims worldwide, was born in the grief of Karbala. Its central register is not triumph, but lamentation. Its founding story is not conquest, but martyrdom. Its recurring question is not how power is won, but what you owe the dead, and what the dead owe you. Every year, on Ashura, the anniversary of Hussein's death, the Shia world goes into mourning. Men process through streets, weeping openly. The grief is not performed, or rather, it is performed in the way that all deep emotion becomes ritual. Because repetition is the only thing that can hold something so vast. This is what Ilyas Kaneti had to say about this in Crowds and Power in 1960. The crowd here celebrates its own passion. It vallows in it. It increases it. Its greatest joy is in its own grief. No faith has ever laid greater emphasis on lament. Kaneti understood from the inside what it means for a people to carry a catastrophe as identity. He recognized in Shia mourning the political energy of collective grief. The way shared lamentation makes a mass of individuals into something with its own power and will. Khomeini understood this, and Khamenei, who grew up in Mashhad, who attended Ashura procession as a boy, who spent his formative years in the seminaries of Qom, learning to think and feel in this tradition, he understood it perhaps better than anyone. In Shia doctrine, the Prophet's family carried a divine authority that no caliph could claim. This authority passed through a line of 12 Imams, ending with Muhammad al-Mahdi. The 12th was said to have gone into occultation in 874 CE. He did not die, he disappeared, hidden from the world, until God restores him near the end of times, when he will return to establish justice. For over 1,000 years, Shia clergy had drawn a quietest conclusion from this belief. The clergy's role was to guide the faithful, preserve the law, and wait. Politics was the province of the corrupt world. Clerics stayed out of it. Khomeini ended this. In 1970, while in exile in Najaf, Khomeini delivered a series of lectures that would remake the world. He called his doctrine Wilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. His argument was simple, and within the tradition he was speaking to, explosive. The hidden Imam's absence was not a reason for passivity. It was a summons. A qualified Islamic scholar had not merely the right, but the duty to govern, to establish an Islamic state, to prepare the ground for the Imam's return. This was Plato's philosopher king dressed in a turban. It was Lenin's vanguard theory translated into the language of Shia theology. It was an idea forged in the encounter between a tradition of sacred grief and a century of secular political thought. Islamic government does not correspond to any of the existing forms of government. It is not a tyranny. It is constitutional government in the specific sense that the rulers are subject to a certain set of conditions. Ayatollah Khamenei, speaking on Islamic government in 1970. Whether one accepts or rejects this vision, its ambition is undeniable. It was an attempt to answer, for the first time in Shia history, the question that Karbala had always posed. What do you do with grief? Do you carry it forever, weeping in procession, waiting for a Messiah? Or do you turn it into something? A state, an army, a revolution? Khomeini answered, you build. And among those who heard his answer and decided to help was a young cleric from Mashhad. 19 years old, newly arrived in sitting in the back of a lecture hall. The education of a revolutionary. Is a city that exists, in a sense, outside ordinary time. Its seminarians have given their lives over to texts that are, many of them, 14 centuries old. The question they're asking, how to live well, how to govern justly, how to stand before God with a clear account, is the same question asked in these rooms for 1,000 years. Khamenei arrived in the late 1950s. He was 19 when he first sat in Khomeini's classes. Khomeini was not simply teaching jurisprudence. He was making the case with extraordinary force and clarity that a cleric who remained silent in the face of injustice was not a servant of God, but a servant of tyrants. This is what Khamenei had to say about his professor of jurisprudence. He taught us that silence is not wisdom. It is cowardice, that a scholar who does not use his knowledge to resist oppression has betrayed his knowledge. I understood this when I was still very young, and I never forgot it. Khamenei speaking in 2009. The Iran Khamenei was growing into was a country under enormous pressure. The Shah had inherited his throne from a father, installed and removed by the British. The son was more dependent on foreign support. Still, the CIA had helped restore him to power in 1953. In 1963, on Ashura, the holiest day of Shia mourning, Khomeini delivered a speech that drew explicit parallels between the Shah and Yazid, Hussein's murderer. He was arrested. His supporters poured into the streets. The crackdown was severe. Khamenei was 24. He carried messages, he gave speeches, he organized. He was arrested for the first time. It would not be the last. Over the next 14 years, he was arrested 6 times by Savak, the Shah's secret police. He was held in solitary confinement. He was subjected to sustained interrogation. He did not break. He was not the kind of man who broke. What he was instead was the kind of man who stored everything, every slight, every humiliation, every hour in a cell, and carried it forward as motivation. In 1977, the regime tried a different approach. They sent him into internal exile to Iran Shahar, a remote desert town far from the networks that had sustained him. The idea was that he would fade there, become irrelevant, be forgotten. He was not forgotten because in 1979, everything changed. The year the world tilted. On the 1st of February 1979, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei descended from a chartered Air France jet at Tehran's Mehrabad airport, ending 15 years in exile. The crowd waiting for him was perhaps the largest ever assembled in Iran. Estimates range from 3 to 5 million people. When a journalist on the plane asked Khomeini what he felt returning to Iran after so long, he replied, famously, nothing. It is one of the most quoted statements of the 20th century, and probably one of the most misunderstood. He did not mean he felt no satisfaction or relief. He meant something more like, my feelings are irrelevant. This is not about me. It is about the idea. The Shah had already fled. The army had already fractured. In the weeks that followed, the Islamic Republic of Iran was declared. And the men who had spent years in seminaries and prisons and exile, who had carried messages in secret and given speeches to small crowds in provincial towns, found themselves suddenly running a country of 35 million people. Khamenei was among them. Ayatollah Khomeini appointed him to lead Friday prayers in Tehran, not a liturgical role, but a political one. In revolutionary Iran, the Friday sermon was the primary instrument of state communication, the place where the regime spoke directly to the people, interpreted events, shaped opinion, framed the enemies. He also served as a member of the Revolutionary Council, as Deputy Minister of Defense, as supervisor of the newly formed Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, the force that would become, over the following decades, the single most powerful institution in Iran. And then, in June 1981, at a press conference in Tehran, a bomb concealed inside a tape recorder exploded. Khamenei survived. His right arm did not. The blast left his right hand permanently paralyzed, a visible mark he would carry for the rest of his life, visible in every speech, every photograph, every ceremony. He learned to gesture with his left hand instead. Some who knew him said it changed him, made him more careful, more deliberate, more aware of what it meant to be mortal. That same year, he became President of Iran. The weight of the inheritance. On the 3rd of June 1989, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei died. 10 million people came to mourn him in the streets of Tehran, a sixth of the entire population. The procession was so immense, the grief so overwhelming, that the burial had to be attempted twice. The first time, the crowd seized the corpse from its casket, tearing at the shroud for relics. The coffin was nearly lost. It is said to be the largest funeral in recorded history. And in the days that followed, a question settled over Iran like dust. Who would lead them now? The expected answer was Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, Khomeini's own designated successor, the most religiously learned man in Iran. But Montazeri had made a fatal error. He had written a letter to Khomeini in 1988. After the mass execution of thousands of political prisoners, many of them barely out of their teens, asking the Imam to reconsider. For this, he was removed from consideration. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. This is an excerpt from the letter that Grand Ayatollah Montazeri wrote to Ayatollah Khamenei. The greatest crime in the Islamic Republic, for which history will condemn us, has been committed at your order. You're being kept ignorant of what is happening in the prisons. The assembly of experts turned to Ali Khamenei. He was 50 years old, a trusted loyalist. But by the standards of the clerical establishment, he was not and never had been an Ayatollah. The solution was found in a matter of days. He was declared an Ayatollah. The constitution was amended. A political calculation was dressed in theological language. Senior clerics across Iran refused to accept his religious authority. Some never did. The legitimacy gap that opened in those days was one that Khamenei spent 35 years trying to paper over, with institutions, with force, with the careful elimination of anyone who challenged him. He took power with an affecting show of humility. In his first address as Supreme Leader in 1989, this is what Khamenei said about himself. I'm an individual with many faults and shortcomings, and truly a minor seminarian. He was not a minor seminarian. He was the unchallenged ruler of a nation of 50 million people, with a loyal military force that answered to him and not to the elected government. The architecture of permanence. Khomeini had ruled through charisma, through the force of a personality so overwhelming that millions had been willing to die for it. Khamenei could not do this. His speeches, delivered in a flat, methodical voice, lacked the incandescent quality of his predecessor. So, he built something else. Over the course of the 1990s and 2000, he transformed the IRGC from a revolutionary fighting force into what can only be described as a parallel state, or a parastatal organization. A structure with its own military capacity, its own intelligence apparatus, its own business empire. By the time analysts tried to measure it, estimates placed its economic footprint at 20 to 40% of the entire Iranian economy. Beyond the IRGC, his appointees controlled the judiciary, the state broadcaster, the Guardian Council that vetted candidates for election. When reformist presidents were elected, Khatami in 1997, Rouhani in 2013, they found the space for meaningful change relentlessly squeezed. The system had been designed not to be governed, but to endure. At the same time, Khamenei was building outward. His foreign policy vision, what he called the axis of resistance, was the most ambitious project of his tenure. Hezbollah in Lebanon became a military force more powerful than many national armies. Shia militias in Iraq gave Iran a land corridor across the region. The Houthis in Yemen provided another front. The logic was anti-imperial, but also deeply personal. Khamenei had watched his country humiliated, sanctioned, its scientists assassinated, its currency destroyed. The Axis was his answer. You cannot strangle a country that has tentacles in 4 other countries. Or so he believed. The people he could not keep. The great recurring crisis of Khamenei's rule was not foreign pressure. It was his own people. In 2009, after a presidential election that most independent observers believed had been systematically falsified in favor of the hardline conservative Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, millions of Iranians poured into the streets. They wore green, they carried signs, they chanted, "Where is my vote?" Khamenei endorsed the result. He declared the election a divine blessing. He called the protesters agents of foreign influence and threatened those who continued to demonstrate with violence. The crackdown that followed was severe. Hundreds were killed, thousands were arrested, dozens were tortured in detention. Protesters were tried in mass proceedings and sentenced to long prison terms or death. The Green Movement did not topple the regime, but something changed in 2009 that did not change back. The covenant between the Islamic Republic and the educated urban middle class, the social layer that had at least partially supported the revolution in 1979, was effectively broken. Khamenei had looked at millions of his own citizens asking a legitimate question about their votes, and he had told them plainly that their votes did not matter. The protests came again in 2017, in 2019, in 2022. The 2022 uprising was different in quality from all the others. Its trigger, the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman arrested by the morality police for an alleged hijab violation, seemed to release something that had been building for years. The slogan that emerged from those streets, Zan, Zindagi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom, was not a demand for economic reform or electoral fairness. It was a rejection of the entire civilizational project that Khamenei's revolution represented. Women cut their hair in the street. They removed their headscarves on bridges and at intersections and in university corridors, holding them in the air. They did this knowing that CCTV cameras were recording everything. The courage required for that gesture is difficult to overstate. The regime responded as it always had. Security forces shot into crowds, hundreds were killed, thousands were arrested, dozens were sentenced to death. Khamenei's response to each wave of protest was identical in its structure and its certainty. Foreign enemies, Western orchestration, CIA plots. He did not appear to believe, even for a moment, that the anger he was facing was real, that it arose from conditions his own governance had created. His worldview had no room for that possibility. This is what Khamenei said on the 2022 protests. These riots and insecurity were designed by America and the occupying fake Zionist regime and their paid agents with the help of some traitorous Iranians abroad. In January 2026, protests swept the country again, beginning with economic grievances, spreading into calls for an end to the regime. According to human rights organization, more than 6,000 people were killed in the crackdowns that followed. 6,000. It was into this context, a government that had just massacred thousands of its own citizens, that the United States and Israel launched their attacks on Iran on the 20th February 2026. The unraveling. The 7th of October 2023 was the day the architecture Khamenei had built for 3 decades began to show its true fragility. On this day, Hamas launched its attack on Israel, killing 1,200 people, dragging 250 back to Gaza as hostages. Khamenei praised it. He had not ordered it, or not directly, but he had created and sustained the environment in which it was possible. What followed was a systematic dismantling of everything he had spent decades constructing. Israel went to war in Gaza with a ferocity that exceeded even its own previous operations. Then, in the autumn of 2024, it turned north. A concentrated bombing campaign killed Hezbollah's entire senior leadership, including its reclusive Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, who led the organization for 32 years. The most powerful non-state military force in the world was, within weeks, effectively decapitated. In December 2024, the Assad government in Syria, propped up for years by Iranian money and IRGC advisors, collapsed in 11 days. Rebels swept into Damascus, Assad fled to Moscow, and with him went Iran's land bridge to Lebanon. In June 2025, Israeli strikes inside Iran killed senior commanders and nuclear scientists. Assassinations were also reported of one of the most senior figures of the Iranian nuclear program. The attacks led to enrichment facilities being damaged, and it demonstrated that the deterrence Khamenei had built, the proxies, the missiles, the calculated ambiguity, was not deterrence at all. It was a provocation that had finally been accepted. None of the proxies declared war. None of them sent forces. They issued eulogies. The silence was the message. Khamenei had become, in the verdict of one analyst, the gravedigger of the revolution he helped lead. He had built a system so focused on external resistance and internal repression that it had hollowed itself out economically, morally, strategically. And the question of succession, always the most revealing question about any autocratic system, told its own story. Khamenei had reportedly said that his son Moshtaba should be excluded from consideration. After his death, Moshtaba Khamenei was named Iran's third supreme leader. The revolution that had overthrown a Shah was passing power from father to son. The last morning. On the 28th of February 2026, Israeli and American aircraft struck dozens of sites across Iran. Among them was a compound in Tehran where Khamenei lived and worked. His wife was killed. One of his sons was killed. A daughter-in-law was killed. And Ali Khamenei, 86 years old, the last surviving member of the founding generation of the Islamic Republic, the man who had been arrested 6 times before he was 40, and who had ruled for 36 years, was dead. He died in the holy month of Ramadan. He died, according to some, a martyr, but not according to Donald Trump. Announcing Khamenei's death on social media, Donald Trump called him one of the most evil people in history. Iranian state television confirmed it an hour later. In the streets of Tehran and Mashhad and Isfahan and Tabriz, Iranians reacted in 2 ways that are both, in their own way, true. Some celebrated, people who had watched their savings evaporate, who'd lost relatives to the crackdowns, who'd lived their whole lives under a system that told them their desires were corruptions. Some mourned. People who genuinely believed, who had given real things to the revolution and received real things from it. Both reactions were real. Both reactions were correct in their own way. A country divided is not a country that has failed to feel. It is a country that has been given two irreconcilable things to feel. What the grief becomes. The Western powers watching Iran in the spring of 2026 are inclined to see in Khamenei's death the death of something larger. Of political Islam as a governing force, of the ideology of the Islamic Republic. Perhaps the Islamic Revolution itself. They have been wrong before. And I think they might be wrong this time. Political Islam is not a relic. It is not a pre-modern atavism that modernity is steadily dissolving. It is itself a product of modernity, a response to the experience of colonization and humiliation, to the failure of secular Arab nationalism, to the spectacle of Western powers supporting one corrupt government after another in Muslim-majority countries while lecturing them about democracy. Tanjil Rashid, writing in the New Statesman, says that Iran's revolution was intellectually more sophisticated than its critics understood. Its theorists had read Heidegger and Sartre and Hugo and Lenin. They had engaged with the full force of Western political thought and had decided, on the basis of that engagement, to reject Western political arrangements. Ali Larijani, the man who managed the crackdown on protesters and served as de facto governor after Khamenei's death, holds a PhD on Immanuel Kant. This is not backwardness. It is a different conclusion. If the Islamic Republic falls, Rashid wrote, its ideology will not fall with it, as Marxism did with the Berlin Wall, into history's trash heap, but into its cauldron to continue melding old passions with a new world. In Bangladesh's most recent elections, Islamist parties made major gains. Turkey and Malaysia, the Muslim world's most developed democracies, are governed by leaders whose politics are rooted in Islamism. The conditions that produced the Iranian Revolution, inequality, humiliation, the failure of secular alternatives, the emotional power of a faith that places martyrdom and resistance at its center, have not been resolved. They have, in many places, intensified. In Mashhad, the shrine of Imam al-Rida still stands. Tens of millions still come each year to press their foreheads against its marble. They come to grieve to a man who died 12 centuries ago. Because in the Shia understanding of the world, the dead are never quite gone, and the grief is never wasted. It becomes something eventually. It becomes politics or poetry or a revolution or a procession through the streets of a city that has seen too much. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was born in the shadow of that shrine. He died believing that what he had built, the state, the resistance network, the ideology, was the proper form of what Karbala required. That it was what Hussein's sacrifice demanded. Whether he was right is a question that Iranians and the wider world will be arguing about for a very long time. What is not in question is this: the grief does not end with the man. It rarely does. You've been watching this short documentary on the life of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, 1939 to 2026.